Perfect. All right. Today we're going to be talking about poetry. I know this may not be super interesting for some of you because you might go, well, I write prose though. I don't write poetry. Poetry can benefit your prose in a lot of ways, and sometimes even writing a couple poems can help inspire you to write more. Or you can use them within your story, laced within. J.R.R. Tolkien is rather infamous for doing this. I would say famous, but some people it bothers them, so infamous. Because he puts lots of songs and ballads and things like that with it, laced within his stuff. And some people actually really, really love that and enjoy that. And especially if you do it every once in a while, I think it can definitely enhance a piece and enhance your work. It can also just enhance a lot of things. So we're going to talk about all the different kinds of poetry today and what they are like, and what it is like to write them. That way we can talk about not only how to write poetry, but also how poetry can benefit your prose. First, though, I want to talk about poetry versus prose and what the difference is. Because the first type of poetry that I wanted to talk about is free verse. Free verse poetry, and I say no rules or anything, you're immediately thinking that could just be prose. That could just be normal prose. What makes it poetry? What crosses the line? The difference is that typically it is put into stanzas. Now, the difference between stanzas and paragraphs is pretty close. They're not quite the same. Stanzas are typically when you break up sentences. So you might say, in May, the flowers dance. And then you have a comma, and then you, whole new line, go, across the roads they tumble. And even though that could be one full sentence if you were doing it in prose, you change it and make it into stanzas. Now, the reason this changes this is because it changes the way it's said, and it changes the way it emphasizes things. This is important to realize even in your prose. Adding a whole new line to something can change the way it's read. Now, if you read, my heart is beating fast, all one line, that wouldn't read very intensely. But if you said, my heart is beating so, period, one line, fast, period, next line, that's going to make it so that it feels much more intense. And so in some ways, using stanzas instead of using paragraphs in your writing can absolutely enhance your writing and make it feel more intense. The main difference, though, between poetry and prose is simply stanzas versus paragraphs. Stanzas being broken up sentences, or shorter, more intense, like maybe paragraph tends to be at least 5 sentences or more, typically. Can there be things that are different than that and break those rules? Yes, but that is the typical. The other difference is the fact that poetry typically wants to paint a picture of beauty, whereas prose wants to paint a picture to help tell a story. So they're two different goals as well. The main thing that you can do to tell the difference, if you were to see them on the page, is one would look like this, because it's in stanzas, and the other would look like that, because it's in prose. So typically, even the formatting alone can help indicate, but the wording too can help indicate. Taking that same sentence that we had again about May and flowers tumbling across the road, you would then start another sentence right after that sentence that would then delineate why the flowers tumbling across the road matters. Like, for example, saying, they seemed so cheery in comparison to how I felt. That it feels much more like, oh, we're painting a scene here, we're telling a story. Whereas if you were doing a poem, you might make that a whole new stanza and say, I felt bitterness, unlike the beauty of those flowers, or something like that. You make it a lot more stark contrast instead of, here's the story. Now, can they be interchangeable? Yes. That's when you get weird things like free verse and prose poetry and all that craziness. Today we're just going to be talking about classic poetry, so that way it's slightly less intermingled. So, free verse, as I previously mentioned, no rhyme scheme is needed, no requirements, no rhythmical kind of crazy separates it from prose is that it is put into stanzas, as I previously. Then you have a bunch of other different types of poetry. First one I want to talk about is one of my personal favorites. It's called a villanelle. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. It might be Vianney or something. I don't know. It's French, so that's part of the problem. It's a 19-line poem that consists of 5 tercets and a quatrain. Now, let me explain. A tercet is a set or group of 3 lines of verse that rhyme together and are connected by that rhyme with an adjacent tercet. Then you typically, for quatrains, is a stanza of 4 lines having alternate rhymes. So this is where people in creative writing classes will probably talk about ABAB rhyming scheme and stuff like that. The best example I can point out of a villanelle is "Do not go gentle into that good night." If you Google that poem and read that, that is a perfect example of the quatrains and the tercets and all that. Part of the reason I would encourage you to write a little poetry, even if you typically write prose, is because it really makes you think about what you're saying and what words you're using. It makes you think about how deliberately you are wording things, because you are trying to rhyme, or you are trying to have it have a certain meter or a certain rhythm pattern. And so even if you do free verse, which puts it into stanzas, it makes you think about how you're phrasing things more purposefully. And with prose, we should be just as purposeful. A lot of people tend to get a little bit more relaxed because of the fact that it's prose, but bless you. but if we treat our prose just as intentionally as poetry, in some ways that's what makes it more powerful. That's why line editors are so important, because line editors help to identify when you're using words that are less powerful and you could be using a more powerful word. Or alternatively, you're using a super powerful word when you should be using a more gentle word. And so practicing some poetry might actually help be able to identify those scenarios. Next thing I'm going to talk about is sonnets. Sonnets are a poem of 14 lines using any number of formal rhyming schemes. In English, typically they have 10 syllables per line. However, don't necessarily have to. The main important thing is the fact that it's 14 lines. It can have any number of rhyming schemes if you want. It can have ABAB, based just simple, or you can have it have BBAA, or whatever you'd like, really. That's the beauty of sonnets. They're a little bit more flexible. Then you have odes. These are lyrical poems. They are typically to address a subject in an elevated style or manner. This is when you can get really funny with it and be like, I'm addressing a hot dog, but then you be very elegant. So you can get goofy with it if you want to. You don't have to take it super seriously. However, odes are typically more serious. They're a lot more to like, mourning my lost lover, things like that. Very dramatic. Then you have limericks. These ones are intentionally humorous. These are 5-line poems with a specific rhyme scheme and rhythm. They are often humorous and known for being easy to memorize because they are so short. The poem typically has A-A-B-B-A rhyme scheme. The reason that they're so funny and whimsical is because of just tradition. If you wanted to, you could write a very grim limerick for no apparent reason at all. I think I would encourage you by the end of this lesson to find at least one that kind of sounds interesting to you and give it a try, just because it can be very fun to explore. I know there was one time where I felt completely and utterly stuck with one of my short stories, and I was like, I don't know, this guy needs to give a speech, and I was like, I'm going to write a villanelle as his speech. And it helped me actually get unstuck. So in some ways, writing a poem about your story or about writer's block or about something that's frustrating you or about something you're dealing with in your life can sometimes help get flowing and help you feel more creative again. All right, especially because it takes a lot of the pressure off because you're not having to build this massive plot. Instead, it's just like, okay, need to make things rhyme. Get it. Next thing is a haiku. Now, haikus sound a little weird in English typically because of the fact that they were originally Japanese. And Japanese words have different syllables than English words. So you can fit a lot more into a haiku in Japanese than you can in English. Haikus are typically 5, 7, 5 for syllabic repetition. So you'll have a line with 5 syllables, a line with 7, and then a line with 5. Hence why it's weird, because English has a lot of multi-syllabic words, whereas Japanese has a lot of single-syllabic words. So it makes it so that in Japanese you have like this beautiful paragraph, and in English it's like 2 lines. Then you have ghazals. They're typically made up of couplets, so rhyming couplets together. Structurally and thematically, they're emotionally independent, but they all have a generalized theme. So it might express love, loss, or separation, something dramatic and deep. And typically, even though each could stand by itself, it together makes a bigger whole story. Next thing is sestina. This is a fixed verse form consisting of 6 stanzas, 6 lines each, normally followed by a 3-line envoy. So envoy just means final stanza. So with that, this one is typically a lot more for the dramatic stuff. It's like in those musicals where it's like someone's dying and they have a whole song about it. This is when a sestina would be actually very good to get your writing juices flowing. If you're like, you've had someone die recently in your book and you're like, I'm gonna write a sestina about this character. Or alternatively, if you have a very artsy character, you could write a bunch of poems that you think your character would write. Or if your character alternatively hates poetry, you could have them write very bitter, frustrated poems. Next thing is a cinquain. This is a 5-line poem, typically, though not always, containing respectively 2 syllables, 4 syllables, 6 syllables, 8 syllables, and then 2 syllables again. So it's kind of like haiku, fancier. Haiku got taken up a notch. Then you have blank verse poetry. Blank verse poetry has no rhyming system. However, it does use what's called iambic pentameter. This is when it goes strong beat, weak beat, weak beat, and it goes in sets of 5. Now, this might sound confusing. I know it sounded certainly very, very confusing for me when I was first learning it in Latin, because Latin is originally one of the first languages to use iambic pentameter. It's a pain in the butt. But it can also be very fun to use, because if you realize that words have rhythm to them, you can use that rhythm to emphasize your sentences. So for example, hoofbeats. When you say the word hoofbeats, one is soft and one is hard. And that's what you want to notice with iambic pentameters. You want to purposely have hard, soft, soft. And so you probably would want to rephrase that sentence, because that would be soft, hard. But you just want to notice how you phrase things. You might even notice that certain names have syllabic components to them. For example, my name is Cheyenne. The shy part is very much the front of it. Anne is very much the soft bit. You wouldn't say it Cheyenne. That sounds weird. It's kind of like the name Katie. It's it's KT. Soft T. It's not KT. Exactly. It's about where you put the stress in the sentence. And so sometimes playing around with iambic pentameter can help you also create very beautiful paragraphs regarding how the reader feels, because the reader can actually feel it subconsciously. Even if they don't notice it, they will notice it ultimately. They'll be like, wow, I don't know why, but that paragraph felt really cool and intense. And it might be because you're using all harsh beats, and so you're really pounding that paragraph into them. Or alternatively, it could be because it's a very whimsical paragraph and you use all soft beats with very, very few harsh beats. And then they're like, oh, this feels very pleasant and soft. And so it can give a sense of those harsh or soft bits to it in your paragraphs. All right, next thing we're going to talk about is elegies. This is a poem of serious reflection, typically a lament for the dead, but it can be a lament of anything, a lament of loss of childhood, a lament of loss of hope or faith. It can be a lament of anything. So if your character is lamenting something, this could be a good way to do it. Yes?
Does it have to do with, like, because it's about mourning, so does it
Yes.
have to do with, like, how you
Yes, elegy is a poem very similar to eulogy. Exactly. Eulogy is the prose version, and elegy is the poetic version. Um, as far as that goes, it is about mourning. So you can mourn a lot of things, though, right? Not just people. Um, so you can use it in multiple different ways, but it very much is like a eulogy. Then we have acrostic. This is one that you've probably run into before, and if you haven't, I would be kind of surprised. This is a poem, or in some ways, a word puzzle, kind of like when you do cat, then you say chaos, art. I don't know what to think of for the last one. Sorry? Tree. There we go. Doesn't make any sense. Typically, they make more sense than that. But the point is, it spells a word if you do it up and down, and typically those are things that you associate with that word. So sometimes people do this for names, for instance. You could do this with your character if you're really wanting to know how to characterize them. I've seen a lot of people do this with their characters, and it's actually quite fun, where you take the name of your character, like, for example, Connor, and then you go like, they're creative, they are optimistic, they are humorous, they never give up, etc., etc. This can be very fun to do too because it helps people get to know your character in a very unique way. So if you have any sort of writing accounts or anything like that, you could give your readers slash viewers teasers and be like, this is an acrostic poem about my character using their name. And that can be very fun way to introduce your character to people. All right, next. Epic. This is a long narrative poem that tells the story of a hero's adventure. Now, this might sound like, wait a minute, didn't we just talk about how prose is a hero's adventure? So what are we doing with poetry being a hero's adventure? Well, as I mentioned before, this is typically in stanzas, and it's up to you whether they rhyme or not, and it's up to you whether or not they have any sort of iambic pentameter or something like that. A great example of this is Virgil's Aeneid was an iambic pentameter, and yet that is considered an epic poem. And then you have the Odyssey, which was originally an epic poem. And so a lot of epic poems were typically more the form. Prose actually didn't really come into being until more like the medieval era. A lot of it was poetry. So you could totally do an epic poem if you wanted to and tell like a 30, 40 page poem about your story. Um, by all means, please do. Please know that you will have a very niche market for it because unfortunately, epic poems have kind of gone the wayside. They've disappeared, which makes me sad because I think they're cool. But Beowulf is a great example of one of the very last epic poems that was very prominent in society. It's very cool. I think it's very awesome. Um, you might have to read it for English at some time, at which point you might think it's less awesome. All right, moving on. There's also the last few that we're going to talk about. A tanka. This is where the syllables are arranged as 5, 7, 5, 7, 7. This is, again, kind of similar to a haiku, but more elaborate. This one actually is, I believe, also Japanese. They really like 5 and 7 syllables. They think it's pretty. I think it's pretty too, but I'm just saying it's very Japanese to have 5 and 7 syllables alternating. Tankas typically don't have a specific purpose. They're just syllabic, and it makes it pretty. Next, we also have concrete poems. These are poems that use an arrangement of words, colors, and space to create a visual image that contributes to the poem's meaning. So, for example, if we wanted to, we could do all I think about is going outside in the rain. I attempted to make a raindrop. Bloop. Yep. So, this is a concrete poem because you are writing technically basically whatever you like, but you're trying to fit it within a certain shape. You can get super complex and do crazy shapes, or you can keep it very simple, do things like raindrops. Yes.
You know, one time I read a poem about like the author's journey.
Yeah.
It was arranged in like the picture of footsteps.
Yes,
So
exactly.
it was really cool.
It's really
Like,
cool.
taking a trip as you read it.
Exactly. That's the beauty of concrete poems. They're physically and aesthetically visual as well as being pretty verbally. A great example. Next one, Pantoums. I didn't look up the pronunciation on these if you can't tell. This is a poem made up of repeated quatrains or 4-line stanzas. Now, with 4-line stanzas, typically all of them rhyme in that 4 sets, but you don't necessarily have to. You can do A, B, A, you can do B, A, C, whatever you want. As long as you have that patterning within your 4-line stanzas. Next is ekphrastic. It's quite a fun thing to say. This is a poem that vividly describes a work of art or a scene. Now, this one might seem like prose, but the difference is that it is typically really getting deep into the art. So it's not just saying, like, this is an art of a meadow. It's saying, like, the flower on the left wilts ever so slightly. Perhaps it is sad. Or things like that. And so you're really getting deep into the art and the scene. This is moments when in your prose perhaps you want to give a super detailed version of this because this scene is going to really, really matter. Or alternatively, you want it to come off as very, very beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, and so you give it that cinematic full treatment. All right, the last two that we're going to talk about. We have ballads. This typically starts with a story and then develops into a poem using rhyme, rhythm, and repetition. I would highly recommend looking up examples of ballads because of the fact that they are incredibly complex. Yes?
I've actually heard ballad. I think
Mhm.
Three Ravens.
Yeah, I definitely have heard of that one. It's quite beautiful. They are quite gorgeous, but they are take a lot of effort because it uses rhyme, rhythm, and repetition and storytelling. So it takes like every element of poetry and crams it all into one. So it's very hard to do, but it's very worthwhile if you can complete it. All right, and then the last one, the easiest of them all, in my opinion, is called blackout poetry. You've probably run across this before. It's where you take a page of already written prose and then you black out the words that you don't want and keep the words that you do want to make a poem. Sometimes this can seem cruel and harsh because you're taking a page, but all you have to do is, just copy a page or like print one offline or something like that, and then you're no longer destroying a book. So if you feel guilty about destroying a book, just find another way. It can be incredibly fun to do this, especially because of the fact that it can make you rethink pages. You have this whole beautiful scene that this author has created, and you're finding new meaning within those words. And it can be incredibly interesting to do so. All right, does anyone have any questions about poetry or applying poetry to prose? All good? Okay. Do we have any suggestions as far as what lesson you guys would like next week? Because this one was actually suggested by someone. So I would love suggestions if you have suggestions. I'll give you time to think on that. Speaking of which, if anyone wants to comment below a suggestion of a lesson, I'm more than happy to take suggestions via comment as well. Once again, we have our writing contest currently going. It will be due the last day of May. So please make sure you try to get it in before then, just because of the fact that obviously if we are closed, unfortunately, I'm sorry, that's not going to work out. So try to make sure you get it in before we close on that last day in May. I think that's it as far as big announcements for the Writers Club. Everything's pretty chill right now. I'm going to turn off the video and we can get started with regular writing time.